has been driven by the need to get a knowledge society throughout the world. And we need to understand this in the context of a century-long expansion of college and university enrollments. Higher education is one of the most rapid growth sectors of the advanced capitalist world. And if we look at the chart and the graph that's in front of you, we see that between 1815 and the period shortly after World War I, there was very little expansion in the relative number of young adults attending colleges or universities. Starting in the 1920s, however, the number of students began to grow at an increasing rate. By 1940, there were approximately 5 million university students worldwide. By 1960, this number had doubled to 10 million. Today, more than 150 million students are attending college and university, and all indications are that the growth of this student body is accelerating. The 2007 UNESCO Statistical Report on Higher Education notes that since 1970, annual growth has been 4.6, and that student populations are doubling every 15 years. To highlight the extraordinary nature of the trend, Schofer and Mayer point out that today there are more students attending colleges and universities in Kazakhstan than there were in the entire globe a century ago. And if we look at this slide, we see that nearly all regions of the world have been a part of this process. Western Europe, North America, and Japan have the most students per capita, approximately 350 students per 10,000 people. But Eastern Europe, after experiencing relatively slow growth in college education during the last communist period, has largely caught up to this trend. As figure 3 demonstrates, the per capita figures show that after the major OECD nations, Eastern Europe, and let's go to figure 3, that Eastern Europe, the Arab world, and Latin America have the highest share of college and university students in the total population. In addition, the student population of the East Asian and Pacific region is growing very rapidly. According to UNESCO again, the student body in China has expanded by 19% per year during the first decade of this century. This trend suggests a doubling in the number of college and university students approximately every 4 years. The one region which has not experienced as rapid growth in university attendance is India and the rest of South and Southwest Asia. On the other hand, the sub-Saharan Africa, which has the lowest proportion of college students in its population, is growing so rapidly that UNESCO estimates that the number of African students will double every 8.4 years. This growth has taken place with significant changes in the regional composition of the university enrollments. There has been a sharp rise in the share of students outside the advanced capitalist world, with the East Asian and Pacific becoming the region that has the largest number of students attending higher education institutions. The Arab world's share of students has increased from 3% to 5%, which in itself represents a significant increase for a region with a relatively small share of the world's population. The percentage of college students in North America has declined from 48% in 1970 to 23% in 2007. Finally, the other striking feature of the expansion of higher education is the increasing participation of women in many regions of the world. Indeed, the faster college enrollment is growing, the more important is the rising share of female students. For example, the number of female and male students in colleges and universities in the Arab world is approximately equal, while in slower growing India, there is still a significantly larger presence of male students. For the world as a whole, the number of male students quadrupled from 17.7 to 75.1 million between 1970 and 2007, while the number of female students rose sixfold from 10.8 to 77.4 million students. Women have achieved global gender parity in terms of enrollments in colleges and universities, even if the distribution of students in particular fields is significantly different for men and women, and there are important regional differences. Unless there is a sharp disruption in the trajectory of the world economy, it is reasonable to expect that this explosive growth in university education will continue. The poorer countries of the world lag significantly behind the richer countries when one examines the share of young adults who are attending post-secondary institutions. As income levels rise and perhaps begin to converge with those of the West, we can expect that student participation will rise as well. Moreover, more rapid population growth in most regions of the non-Western world, with the notable exception of China, should further fuel the growth of university education in lower middle-income countries. The rapid increase in population, combined with significant per capita income growth, makes the Arab Gulf particularly affected by these global trends. The extraordinary growth in higher education that we have documented suggests that contemporary socioeconomic evolution creates an intensifying demand for higher education. Governments and international organizations view the establishment of a robust system of universities and colleges as an essential part of a credible economic development strategy, while increasing proportions of national population groups link social and economic advance to receiving recognized higher education credentials. To gain a deeper understanding of the socio-political dynamics which have created this almost universal consensus on the importance of higher education, it is useful to step back and consider more abstractly social scientific literature on the place of higher education in contemporary society. There are three distinct arguments that we need to consider in order to obtain a full picture of the roles that higher education is hypothesized to play in today's society. The dominant claim is economic and bases itself on neoclassical economic growth theory. The second two are social and political and focus on the connection between higher education, socioeconomic integration, and the imperatives of a capitalist world order. The three functionalist theories concentrate on different social processes, but taken together provide a coherent analytic description of the assumed purposes of higher education and the reasons for its stunning growth. Examining the economic role of higher education necessarily comes first. If higher education has no positive economic function, it would be difficult to make the case that universities and colleges contribute to political stability or social integration. Human capital theory, thus, provides the theoretical foundation for all those who link improved higher educational output to more dynamic economic performance. The argument is straightforward. Education gives individual students advanced skills that allow them to produce more output per work hour when they enter the workforce. This increase in human capital will redound to the benefit of the individual, since more effective productive economic performance will, over time, translate into increases in real income. Even those who have not received a university education benefit from the production of a more highly skilled workforce, since greater economic output generates more disposable income and an increased demand for employment in relatively unskilled occupations such as construction, retail services, and transportation services. These positive externalities provide one justification for the partial subsidization of university operations. Another aspect of human capital theory is the link that theorists have made between the production of new technologies and higher education. Not only do university graduates obtain higher level skills, but a subset of graduates, mainly scientists and engineers, are better able to invent and, perhaps more importantly, innovate or develop practical applications for commercial economic activities. Scientific progress and progressive changes in economic life are key economic features of the contemporary period, even if this was not always the case. Economic globalization is both a cause and effect of economic growth and the intensified accumulation of human capital through the expansion of higher education. The reality of intensified international competition and the need to keep up with and develop new technologies have led many commentators to support the development of a modernized higher educational system that can produce technologically adept and creative workers. Without this capability, policymakers fear that countries or whole regions will fail to adapt to technological imperatives and become economically irrelevant. This is why the GCC policymakers have increasingly stressed the need to improve the education system in general and the higher educational system in particular in order to create the knowledge society. While there is undoubtedly a strong case for specialized training in order to promote economic development, and while one can also draw on standard economic theory to explain why the state must be involved in organizing and promoting such training, it does not follow that the university system we observe today efficiently produces the trained workers that a modern economy needs. To be more precise, human capital theory does not seem to have an explanation for the mismatch between the occupations available and graduate qualifications that universities regularly produce throughout the world. One can go back to the beginning of the university system to note that the initial purpose of the University of Al-Qarawiyyin in Morocco, Al-Azhar in Egypt, or the first medieval universities of Europe was to train clerics and theologians. This imperative had little to do with the economic development, but much to do with social and cultural integration. Moreover, this training ground of political cultural workers allowed some talented students from humble backgrounds to enter into the elites. The emergence of more secular states during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which was based on the imagined community of the nation, stimulated an expansive phase of higher education formation that led universities to slowly distance themselves from their religious origins. Instead, universities became locations where professionals like lawyers, doctors, and business people could be trained to build a modern nation and economy. Relying on aristocratic and mercantile elites were no longer viable, and modern nation states building required the creation of a meritocratic society of a greater number of qualified professionals who could both organize increasingly complex production and distribution systems and use rationalist techniques to mediate conflict and legitimate new social practices. Increasing numbers of strangers who did not have the social legitimacy of nobility needed to communicate and cooperate with each other. They needed to be accredited as worthy members of an educated elite, and universities were uniquely placed to provide this service. It is important to realize that this functionalist, institutionalist analysis suggests that university formation is a transnational process. The first modern secular universities first emerged in Europe and North America, then spread to other outposts of the advanced capitalist world, such as Japan, then moved on to the colonized and semi-colonized periphery, and then became a truly global phenomenon in our postmodern globalized world. The nation-building process did not produce unique higher educational systems, but rather ones that are surprisingly similar or isomorphic. As Mayer et al. State, clearly there are worldwide models for higher education, and these models render higher education as essential to the successful nation state. And in fact, higher education spreads in rather standardized form where the nation-state system spreads. I can see that I'm going to bore you with this historical presentation, so I'm actually going to jump over the historical development to a question that John poses, which is, what does educational globalization mean, since this is more into the topic of this workshop? It is important not to confuse the global growth of higher education we have documented with educational globalization. When we use this term, we are referring to two processes, one that can be measured relatively straightforwardly and one that requires a greater degree of qualitative analysis. The quantitative side of educational globalization refers to an increasing intensity of cross-border interactions as educational growth takes place. The qualitative side examines the tendency of this intensified international commerce to create similar institutions and cultural understandings. This assumption of social homogenization is similar to the earlier post-war visions of modernization theory, and indeed harks back to Marx's and Engels' arguments in the Communist Manifesto, which describes the chaotic and violent rise of industrial capitalism leading to the creation of a world after Europe's own image. Thomas Friedman has more recently celebrated this tendency with his pronouncement that the world is flat. There are no comprehensive data sets that track the movements of academic personnel across national borders. On the other hand, UNESCO does collect considerable information on the movements of students. The overall results on student mobility suggest that higher education growth has been globally neutral. As the UNESCO Global Education Digest of 2009 states, the global outbound mobility ratio was 1.8%. This means that approximately 2 out of every 100 tertiary students left their home countries to study. Moreover, this figure has barely changed since 1999, when it was 1.9. So despite the dramatic rise in absolute numbers, the global share of mobile students has largely remained the same. Globally, student mobility has kept a pace with student enrollment. This broad measure of international student mobility is interesting, but hides as many trends as it reveals. When we disaggregate the world, the neutral growth regions are North America, East Asia, and the Pacific, Latin America and the Caribbean, and East and Central Europe. On the other hand, more extroverted growth has taken place in Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Arab world. Finally, Western Europe and South and Southwest Asia have been experiencing introverted higher education growth. The data also reveal two other important trends. First, increasing numbers of women are becoming internally mobile students, and second, much of the mobility we observe is taking place within a region as opposed to across regions. With respect to gender, women represent nearly half of all internationally mobile students. With respect to intra-regional mobility, two trends stand out. A large proportion of mobile Central Asian students are receiving their education within the Russian Federation, while increasing numbers of Chinese students are attending tertiary institutions in the region. Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, in the region meaning Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. In the Central Asian case, we might label this misleading globalization, since presumably during the time of the Soviet Union, many students traveled from what are now independent Central Asian republics to the present-day Russian Federation. The latter case of increased Chinese emigration to neighboring English-speaking countries does represent a new trend. It is important to note that within the Arab world, there are very different mobility or globalization trends. The following table reports the outward mobility ratio for college students within a particular nation in 2007. As you can see, if we look at the outbound mobility ratio here, we'll see that which country has the most? It's Qatar. Qatar is the one that is sending most of its students outside. But it's also receiving more students inside. An examination of the data reveals sharp variations in the extent to which students from different nations move across borders to receive college or university educations. Of the large countries, Moroccan college students are most likely to study outside the country, while the percentage of Egyptian students who study abroad is surprisingly low. It is noteworthy that the small Gulf states all exhibit very high mobility ratios. There are no reports about the UAE, but Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar all send a relatively high proportion of their students to study outside the country, while Saudi Arabia's outward mobility ratio is 1.9. UNESCO also reports on the number of non-resident students studying within the country. And once again, the Gulf states possess a high inward mobility ratio. For the Gulf countries which report data on the numbers of international students attending tertiary institutions within their country, we have the following data. While the reports from UNESCO are not complete, the general trend is clear. If we just examine the number of students moving into and out of the country to receive higher education, the small Gulf states have a globally extraverted educational system. Qatar in particular is interesting because it is both sending large numbers of students outside the country while receiving even larger numbers who wish to study in Qatar. While we do not have data, it is likely that such a phenomenon is similar in the United Arab Emirates. The student mobility numbers highlight important differences between regions of the world and the unusually extraverted nature of higher education in the Gulf. Yet a singular focus on what we can relatively easily measure cannot directly cast light on important trends in global educational practices. We do not know from the data we have presented whether or not: 1, higher educational institutions from the advanced capitalist world are increasingly establishing cross-border presences. Higher education institutions are increasingly subject to common methods of assessment. Academic curricula are becoming more homogeneous. English is becoming a common language of instruction. A global corps of administrators and professors, largely trained in the advanced capitalist world, have emerged to run colleges and universities in a similar way. Personal policies and academic governance have become more similar. The structural relationships between higher education institutions within one country have become more similar across countries. I would argue, this is John arguing, I would argue that Singapore has been the world leader in the creation of cross-border linkages between different universities, as well as promoting the establishment of branch campuses. By 2009, 12 branch campuses had been established, and 1,120 cross-border educational arrangements were operational. In Asia and the Gulf as a whole, Naidu's work demonstrates that both the quantity and intensity of international educational partnerships are increasing. One can also examine this phenomenon from the perspective of the institutions exporting educational programs and campuses. In this case, Australia is by far the most active exporter of program mobility. with 1,569 education programs and 37 institutions operating in the program mobility landscape. The overall intensity of Australia's activity was 42.4 programs per institution, compared with 12.7 programs for the UK-based institutions. In absolute terms, the United States is the third most active exporter of programs, followed by New Zealand and Canada. The growth of cross-border collaborative arrangements between Western universities on the one hand and host country governments and higher educational institutions on the other requires the development of common methods of assessment. This is obvious for those institutions which offer joint programs, since any Western university granting, for example, an MBA to students who never set foot on the home university campus must nevertheless guarantee that all students receiving the degree are subject of similar curricula and evaluated in similar ways. Any attempt to do otherwise risks undermining the credibility of the degree-granting institutions. Knight's work on education hubs, however, suggests a broader dynamic. Non-Western governments and higher educational institutions are trying to crash the party and establish elite centers of knowledge production and dissemination. By attempting to be compared to their Western counterparts, these institutions willingly subject themselves to Western assessment bodies in order to reach a higher global ranking. As Marginson and van der Vende put it, global university rankings have cemented the notion of a world university market arranged in a single league table for comparative purposes and have given a powerful impetus to intranational and international competitive pressures in the sector. The two most important research rankings are by Shanghai Jiao Tong University and the Times Higher Education Supplement. Thus, Asian institutions are taking a leading role in imposing international, i.e. Western, standards on their own higher educational systems. In addition to the quest for global ranking, another way to establish a global assessment regime is for universities and colleges to obtain a common type of accreditation. What we are referring to here, however, is accreditation of degree programs by professional associations, such as the Association to Advance Collegiate Schools in Business, known as the AACSB, or by assessment boards such as the Middle States that certify the worthiness and quality of an entire institution. The combination of increasing cross-border collaborations and the adoption of common modes of ranking and accreditation has clear implication for the core of the academic project, providing degrees to qualified students who have undertaken a structural course of study. Joint degree programs almost always mean that instruction will be in English, and that the establishment of branch campuses requires both the adoption of both English instruction and a nearly identical curriculum. To ensure uniformity and the maintenance of quality, sponsoring Western institutions will also appoint Western academic administrators to oversee these initiatives. Not surprisingly, these chancellors, academic vice presidents, and deans will hire professors who have received these degrees from English-speaking countries. Finally, those universities seeking a stamp of approval from the Middle States Association must adopt a liberal arts curriculum based on the American model. Moreover, if one institution improves its standing by receiving Western accreditation, pressure is placed on competitive institutions to adopt similar standards. The spread of Western curricula and English language instruction is often promoted by governments' accrediting boards who require Western approval for an academic program or the existence of partnership agreements before receiving government certification. All of these trends provide strong support for the global homogenization hypothesis. One question is about governance, and are these universities, in addition to adopting Western curricula, Western accreditation and assessment methods, are they also adopting similar institutions of governance? Despite these trends of convergence, it is less clear that these developments carry other institutionalized governance practices with them. In the West, established academic institutions have governance systems that are quite different from other workplaces. Academic workers themselves are largely responsible for the development and management of the curricula. Senior professors have both job security, tenure, and unusual amounts of freedom to pursue research projects which interest them and to structure their own working day. Moreover, substantial authority is given to scholars to determine who amongst the junior apprentices are eligible to enter the ranks of the tenured professorate. All of this suggests that academic workers are more intimately involved in the governance of their own institutions than most other professionals, even if formal power resides with the university administrators. It is important to note that academic administrators normally are recruited from the ranks of senior academic workers. This model is under some threat in the US, as economic disruptions and cost pressures encourage academic administrators to draw on a more contingent workforce who have only temporary contracts. Nevertheless, the question is worth asking. Does the attempt to create high-quality, westernized degree programs or academic institutions imply the adoption of governance institutions we have just outlined? Scholars have spent less time studying the issues associated with governance. This would require more detailed institution-specific studies than the aggregating of information that could be extracted from these ethnographies. On a more general impressionistic level, however, we have reason to be skeptical of the argument that there has been an increase in the number of academic self-managed universities as a result of higher education globalization. I have observed in my study of new Gulf universities and colleges that educational restructuring is a top-down process driven by state policy and/or educational entrepreneurs who wish to control the institution they created. Kaho Mok, in his important article, Questing for Internationalizing of Universities in Asia, Critical Reflections, has described globalization as an attempt to create prestigious institutions that can directly and indirectly promote economic dynamism. The emergence of new academic centers inevitably creates a new hierarchy of higher educational institutions and a decline in the prestige and influence of indigenous institutions which are left behind. Thus, it would be misleading to limit our investigations of governance to the most prestigious institutions. We should link this issue to the evolution of all higher education institutions within a society, for it might be that the emergence of a more privileged, engaged group of faculty in elite colleges and universities is purchased by creating an enlarged group of proletarianized academics who have fewer rights and more contingent employment. Mok's analysis tells us that there is an element of coercion in the institutional restructuring dynamic we have outlined. Not all faculty or students necessarily benefit from the drive to create prestigious, more Western-oriented academic programs. And Mok, by suggesting that educational internationalization is a polite word for educational imperialism, argues that this type of educational restructuring might not be in the national interest as well. We cannot assume that the transplantation of academic programs will automatically carry with them the participatory practices of academic governance in the West. the creation of faculty senates, and related regulations that promote academic autonomy will most likely depend on the characteristics of the host society. Indeed, to the extent that educational globalization differentiates colleges and universities in both home and host countries, perhaps the corporatization process described by Mark implies that the democratic and liberal traditions of the academy are eroding everywhere. If this is the case, then the world is flat. The world is flat hypothesis may be correct, but not in the liberating way its proponents often celebrate. Now we turn to the GCC in particular and how it is affected by educational globalization. It is fitting that this conference on the global university is being held at the American University of Sharjah. Although the University of Wollongong in Dubai was the first Western-style non-state university established in the region, the formation of AUS represented a much more ambitious effort to remake higher education. In addition, the parallel establishment of Sharjah University and the creation of University City integrated educational restructuring with economic development, another feature of efforts to remake higher education in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. I would argue that the educational developments we have witnessed in every GCC nation have 5 key features. The creation of new institutions that challenge the relatively recently established state universities, the establishment of a private and semi-private sector that has strong ties to academic institutions outside the nation, the utilization of accreditation and certification systems that rely on Western academic practices, the adoption of English as the language of instruction, and the implementation of Western-inspired curricula that include the promotion of general education and the liberal arts for beginning college students. My co-author, me, and I are attempting to document this process and analyze its multiple effects. Our project is actually, I'm just going to take a break here and describe our project. We are working on basically trying to describe what is going on in the Gulf in terms of tertiary education, trying to define what are the structural models that have been adopted by the various universities in the Gulf. We are looking at all the Gulf states except for Saudi Arabia. And our second major goal in this project is to find out whether the developments that are taking place in the Gulf are really sustainable and whether they serve the national interests of this region. So that is our project, and this is part of it. And he actually tries to summarize some of our findings. Obviously, we're still only halfway through the project. So he has some general conclusions. One of them is the educational reform process is by no means uniform. Oman, Bahrain, and Dubai have tended to adopt a free market approach, and this has meant the creation of a relatively large number of small IT and business schools that run on a for-profit model. It is also the case that British Commonwealth and some non-European universities based in Jordan, Egypt, and India have played a more prominent role in forming alliances with these new institutions. On the other hand, Qatar's educational city has taken a much more elite route. The Qatar Foundation sponsors high-profile branch campuses of American institutions to offer BAs in particular disciplines. At the same time, there has been an aggressive and controversial drive to reform Qatar University, and this in collaboration with the RAND Corporation. If the new institutions of Oman, Bahrain, and Dubai tend to be small and underfunded, the higher educational establishments of Qatar are awash in subsidies. In between these two models lie Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Abu Dhabi. Both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia have seen the establishment of many new colleges and universities of varying quality and with varying degrees of support from the state without launching aggressive reform efforts of public universities. In contrast, the UAE has attempted to Americanize its state educational system through the creation of Zayed University and also in Al Ain, and through problematic and controversial reforms in Al Ain. In Abu Dhabi itself, a large number of new colleges and universities have been established. Some are clearly prestige projects, such as New York University Branch Campus and the Masdar Institute. Others have been formed by members of the ruling family, such as Khalifa University, and well-established business groups. Some of these new institutions are small and provide business and IT-focused educations. Others, such as Abu Dhabi University, are attempting to construct a university similar to Sharjah University or AUS. Our second finding, preliminary finding, there has been a shift to English language education with the concomitant establishment of foundation programs to train students who are both unprepared in general to do college-level work and who are especially deficient in high-level English language skills. A common theme that has emerged in most of our investigations is that it is difficult to get students to the appropriate academic level, and there is a considerable pressure to admit students prematurely. This has profound implications for teaching students how to think critically, the one goal that nearly all advocates of higher education reform embrace. Third, increasing numbers of institutions have adopted an American-style curriculum. Beginning students are required to follow a liberal arts general education program, even though higher-level policymakers emphasize the importance of technical training in science and engineering. This is actually the point my presentation this afternoon is going to talk about. Fourth, authoritarian traditions of governance and the creation of for-profit schools have made it very difficult to establish systems of participatory management in the new universities and colleges. Faculty must play a major role in curricular design and student evaluation, and yet it's difficult in many institutions for faculty members to exercise their voice. The problem is worsened when teaching loads in many of the new institutions are as great as 5 courses per semester. Fifth, assessing the impact of these developments on the quality of higher education is difficult. Many more students now have access to a more diversified set of rigorous offerings, but it is not clear how many will be successful students. Moreover, we do not yet know whether these new models of higher education will allow national citizens to participate effectively in efforts to create knowledge societies. This discussion can take us in many research directions. So before John closes, perhaps it would be useful to mention some key issues that confront scholars studying the education globalization process in the GCC. First is the deceptively simple problem of how we can best categorize the complex processes I have described here. We are studying the creation of new institutions and organizations, and it is not easy to describe this process efficiently and accurately. To take 2 issues, what is a private higher education system? Is the American University of Kuwait really a non-state institution, given its close links to the ruling family of Kuwait? AUK, that is American University of Kuwait, describes itself as a for-profit institution, while AUS as a non-profit institution. Does this distinction really matter? Only detailed, institutionally sensitive, and comparative research can answer these questions. Beyond accurately describing the process of educational reform in the Gulf, a second research issue is assessing which of the models of higher education we have described are most likely to be academically and financially sustainable. What will the GCC higher educational system look like in the future? Will such institutions effectively educate the student population it is serving? A third research question involves studying the domestic and international political economic implications of the emergence of a new university system in the GCC. How are the societies of the GCC being restructured by higher educational reform? What do these transformations tell us about the place of this region in the world economy and polity? Concluding remarks on the role of the faculty in educational globalization and the maintenance of an alternative culture of globalization. Given the different pressures placed on higher educational institutions by parents, students, businesses, and governments, it is likely that universities will remain a contested terrain. These cross-currents challenge faculty and administrators, but also provide them with some space in which to construct higher educational institutions that help meet the goals and aspirations of academics. We should not lose sight of the fact that most of us carry our own global culture, which is distinct from the trends I have outlined in the first part of this paper. At the most general level, the academic workforce is exposed to a culture that views the university as a location in which scholars are engaged in the disinterested pursuit and communication of knowledge. Graduate students become professors after an unusually long apprenticeship. During this training period, graduate students learn the content and research techniques of their specialized fields and then prove their worth to the Guild of Professors by initiating and completing an original research project. Along the way, students normally absorb an ethos that stresses the disinterested pursuit of knowledge, the sharing of research findings with the rest of the academic community. The extensive and detailed use of references to acknowledge the work of other scholars and the adherence to rigorous standards of proof that include the use of logic and evidence to validate one's argument. Finding the truth, quote unquote, is within the academy, a good in and of itself, and the highest academic awards are received by those scholars and intellectuals who are judged to be the most rigorous and original researchers in their fields. Moreover, higher institutions which receive the highest ranks normally include those scholars who do the most high-profile research. Whether or not these investigations promote economic growth, facilitate national integration, or more effectively respond to the needs of the global economy. An educational institution that promotes the disinterested pursuit of knowledge often fits uneasily within the established order. While a majority of professors are not particularly politically engaged, the culture of academic freedom means that it is expected that institutions will protect and tolerate those scholars who provide political, social, or cultural critiques of the world around them. Students, as well, often take advantage of their newfound autonomy to embrace ideas and movements which place them in opposition to the status quo. Thus, we often observe the paradoxical protests of students who, as a result of their higher education, are more likely to become part of the political and economic elites against whom they protest. In other words, higher education will always remain a terrain where government officials, business interests, and advisors in international organizations such as the World Bank attempt to impose their somewhat contradictory visions on a sometimes recalcitrant faculty, university administration, and student body. A unique feature of higher education reform efforts is that the workforce has an unusual ability to frustrate the best laid plans of ambitious reformers. This is partly because the faculty themselves embrace an ideology that champions faculty autonomy and unrestricted academic freedom. In addition, the need to cede curricular governance and classroom instruction to this workforce means that universities and colleges cannot be changed through top-down fiats. The fact that the most creative students also savor the relative freedom of academic work gives even more social support to an ideology that champions the claim that the production of knowledge and critical discourse are the ultimate purposes of tertiary education. This academic culture has a powerful global reach. Despite the skepticism I have expressed in parts of this discussion about the social and economic contributions of educational globalization, it would not surprise me if the ultimate result of the creation of a global university education system is the establishment of a global ethos of inquiry and criticism that continues to challenge the political economic order that spawned it.